All right, let's turn now to a central concept in environmental ethics, this notion of ecocentrism, and as it relates to what's sometimes called the last person argument. Notice that up until now, much of our discussion throughout the last couple of weeks, the couple last few modules, has been focused on and talking about individual beings, non-human animals versus humans, and whether or not, non-human animals have the same amount of value as humans, whether it's morally wrong to eat animals, right? So these are all individual beings. Humans, animals, maybe even we would include plants. Whether or not they have any sort of moral standing or any moral value, whether they're a part of the moral community at large. But as we turn to ecocentrism, this actually represents an important shift in the focus, right? We're moving away from talking about these individual beings, and instead we're going to be centering our attention on the moral value of whole ecological systems, whole ecological groups that include things like species, biotic communities, and the biosphere as a whole, really. So to understand why this shift matters, why it's so radical, we need to focus on a very important thought experiment in environmental ethics. And this, again, this is called the last person argument. So the last person argument begins by asking us to imagine the following sort of scenario, this following kind of thought experiment. Imagine that the Earth is coming to an end and all of humanity is about to go extinct. Picture yourself as essentially the last surviving person on Earth. You will never reproduce again, so there's never going to be any other humans. You're the only human left. Now imagine that you go around destroying every single ecological system there is. You're destroying every single living thing that you encounter. You're cutting down forests, you're poisoning rivers, setting fires to grasslands, wiping out all sorts of different species. You are the last person, so no future human will ever be harmed by your actions. So if you think that you're doing something morally wrong, if you share that intuition that many people have, that there's something wrong with doing all this, it cannot be because we are depriving future generations of this natural resource. It can't be because these ecosystems, these animals, these rivers are going to help us in some way. We're not going to use them because there won't be anybody there. There won't be anybody left to actually utilize those natural resources. No one's ever going to miss the trees. No one's going to care whether there's a river left or any animals left because no one's there to care in the first place. So here's the basic question that I want to ask. Is what the last person does morally wrong? Well, if we're thinking about things purely from an anthropocentric perspective, that is, if moral value is tied to humans' interest, to what it can get us, right? If we're thinking about the environment's value insofar as it's instrumentally valuable because it's a resource that we can exploit, then it seems very hard to say that what the last person does is morally wrong. And that's because no person is ever harmed. No future generations are ever deprived. Yet still, many of us do seem to have this intuition that such destruction would be morally objectionable. So this thought experiment that we're calling the last person argument, essentially it's challenging us to consider the nature, that nature itself is intrinsically valuable, not merely instrumentally valuable insofar as it can produce or it's a product for us to exploit. Rather, it suggests that ecosystems and natural environments, they deserve moral consideration in and of themselves, even apart from any human use that we might exploit. Now, of course, some people might object to this and say, well, look, a part of these ecosystems are living animals, maybe even insects, and so maybe it's harmful for them. But we can still imagine that, like every single human life and animal life, that all living creatures have been destroyed except for you. You are not only the last person, but you're the last animal on the planet. If you still went around destroying ecosystems like all the forests, polluting the rivers, destroying the soil, and so on and so forth, even that still seems morally problematic. So that's one of the main motivators for this view that we're calling ecocentrism. So let's define what that actually means. Because this intuition that we seem to have leads directly towards it. It's a motivator for this view. So to define ecocentrism, basically what we're saying is the view that ecological wholes, various habitats or ecosystems, the biosphere as a whole, that all of this has moral standing. All of it should be considered a part of the moral community. Whether we consider it a person or not is a separate issue, but it does have moral value. It has moral worth. It's a part of the moral community. They're not merely collections of individuals, but entities in their own right that can be valued and respected, and potentially even harmed. And now notice that this is a significant expansion of the moral community, right? It goes beyond mere sentient-based ethics. For instance, the sort of ethics we consider with regard to utilitarianism that said in order to be a part of the moral community, you have to be sentient, or the sort of thing that can suffer, feel pain. It goes beyond that. Indeed, it says that we should include all these ecosystems, all these different communities matter in some regard, matter morally speaking. For instance, Aldo Leopold, who we're going to say a little bit more about here momentarily, captures this view with his famous idea of the land ethic, which calls for seeing ourselves as members of a broader ecological community in the same way that we consider ourselves part of a culture or a family or maybe even a religious community. But before we get into that, let's make sure that we really understand why the last person argument matters. Essentially, the last person argument continues to be influential even today because it looks like it shows where anthropocentric approaches are really quite inadequate. If morality were only about people, right? If morality only involves the normative actions that we should be concerned about between you and me, for instance, then it would be quite difficult to explain why it would be morally wrong for the last person to annihilate all of nature, right? The thought experiment presses us to admit essentially that there must be something wrong about destroying nature, even in the absence of human interests. Of course, not everyone agrees with this point. There are critics who argue that what really bothers us about the last person scenario is some sort of an aesthetic or emotional response rather than a moral one. Others will argue that even if this is the case, there are some indirect harms to humans, that are present. For instance, the last person is betraying humanity's legacy, you might say. Or perhaps the last person who's destroying everything is dishonoring past generations. Perhaps that's one way to respond. But for many environmental ethicists, the most compelling interpretation is that the destruction of nature is wrong because nature itself has moral worth. Nature itself is morally valuable. And if you take that seriously, that introduces another approach to ethics, what's sometimes called holistic ethics. And ecocentrism really pushes us into that direction, that realm of holistic ethics, where ethical systems assign value not just to individual beings, but to collective wholes. This view invites us to essentially rethink the structure of moral value so that different species, different ecosystems, and natural communities, they're not simply resources for us to exploit. And as we relate that to things like factory farming, we can start to understand that animal welfare matters insofar as they are bearers of moral worth in their own right. And so thinking about this relationship between ecocentrism and holistic ethics is going to connect us with this point about deep oncology and Leopold's land ethics, both of which will help us more fully understand what it actually means to live within an ecocentric moral perspective. So focusing on these different issues and the relationship between them, that's going to be our main topic for the next video.